I was looking for a car to buy for my son's 18th birthday. He was about to graduate high school, and I thought a reliable car would be the perfect gift, a way to reward him for his hard work and give him some freedom before heading off to college. Naturally, I started my search on all the typical car buying websites, Cars.com, eBay Motors, even Facebook Marketplace. But everything I found was overpriced or out of budget. It seemed impossible to find a decent deal. That's when I turned to Craigslist. Craigslist has a bit of a reputation, sure, but it's also where you can sometimes find the kind of deal that makes you wonder if it's too good to be true. About a week into my search, I found one of those deals. An '03 Toyota Camry with only 67,000 miles, no reported accidents, no visible damage, and listed as being in great condition. All for $3,500. A car like that? For that price? It felt like a steal. The seller, a man who called himself Bob, lived just 10 miles from me. It was close enough to check out the car without too much hassle. I gave him a call, and he sounded perfectly normal, friendly, even. He assured me there were absolutely no issues with the car. "It runs like a dream," he said. That sealed it for me. I told him I'd come by later that day to check it out. I wasn't planning on paying the full $3,500. Who does that? I had the cash ready in case I needed it, but I fully intended to haggle him down. That's just how these things work. I showed up to Bob's place about 15 minutes early. His house was a small, run-down property at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by a lot of open space. The kind of place where you could scream for help and no one would hear you. That should have been my first red flag. His garage was open, so I pulled up and glanced inside as I parked. The garage wasn't empty. It was packed with car parts, engines, tires, tools, you name it. But there was no sign of the Toyota Camry. The only vehicle on the property was an old, beat-up pickup truck. I assumed the Camry was parked somewhere else, maybe out back or on another part of the property. I approached the front door to make sure I had the right house. The doorbell was missing, so I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again. Still nothing. I stood there for 5 minutes, knocking every so often, but no one answered. Confused, I decided to give Bob a call. That's when things started to get strange. The moment I dialed his number, I heard a phone ringing from inside the house. It was faint but unmistakable. That confirmed I was at the right place, but it also made me uneasy. Why wasn't he answering? I knocked again, louder this time, but still no response. I started to think maybe he hadn't heard me. Maybe he was out back or in the garage and couldn't hear the knocks over whatever he was doing. So, I decided to take a quick look through one of the windows to see if anyone was inside. Big mistake. The house was dark. I could barely make out anything, but I did see an old-fashioned dining room set, the kind you'd see in a house that hadn't been updated in decades. Then my eyes landed on something, or someone, standing at the back door. It looked like a man, staring outside, completely still. Bob, I thought, relieved. I knocked on the window to get his attention, but he didn't move, not even a little. At this point, I was starting to get frustrated. I figured he must have some kind of hearing issue or just didn't realize I was there. There was no fence or gate around the property, so I decided to walk around the house to the backyard to speak to him directly. That's when I saw it. The figure at the back door wasn't Bob. It wasn't even alive. It was a human, a taxidermied human. It stood upright, dressed in plain clothes, staring blankly out the back door like some kind of grotesque statue. My brain struggled to process what I was looking at. The hair, the skin, it all looked disturbingly real. Pure adrenaline kicked in. I turned and ran back the way I came, not stopping until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, desperate to get the hell out of there. Before I drove off, I made one last mistake. I looked back at the house. The blinds on the window I'd peeked through were now closed, but 2 slats were bent, as if someone were peeking out. Someone was watching me. I slammed on the gas and didn't stop until I was home. The whole way back, my mind raced with questions. Where was the Camry? Why were there so many car parts in the garage? And most importantly, why the hell was there a taxidermied human in that house? The only answer that made any sense was chilling. There was no car. There never was. The ad was a lure, designed to get someone, anyone, onto that property. Whoever Bob was, He had no intention of selling me a car. And judging by that human statue, I was probably very, very close to becoming his next project. What do you think Bob was planning? Was the taxidermied figure a warning, or was it the result of someone falling into his trap? And what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have called the police, or just left it all behind like I did? Let's talk about it. This happened when I was really little, probably around 5 or 6 years old. My mom was a single parent, and because of her busy schedule, I was often left alone at night. She always made a point to check on me, though, especially when she'd get up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. It was her way of making sure I felt safe, even if she wasn't always around during the day. But this one night was different. This one night, I remember waking up to something I still can't fully explain. It started with a sound, a soft, faint noise coming from the direction of my closet. At first, I thought it might just be the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that the noise wasn't random. It sounded deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving inside my closet. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my heart beating a little faster. That's when I noticed her, my mom, standing at the foot of my bed. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, smiling at me in the dim glow of my nightlight, and gave me a playful little wave. Her presence immediately made me feel calmer. If she was there, then everything must be fine, right? Moms don't let anything bad happen. Go back to sleep, she said softly, her voice as warm and reassuring as always. Then, to my surprise, she turned and walked toward my closet. I watched her closely as she opened the closet door. Not all the way, just enough to slip inside. She stepped in and pulled the door almost shut behind her, leaving it just barely open. From my bed, I could see her eye peeking out through the narrow crack between the door and the frame. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. She just stood there, with her head slightly tilted, her eye fixed on me through the crack. I remember vividly how unsettling it was, even as a little kid. It didn't feel like something my mom would do. It was playful in a way, sure, but also wrong. The longer I stared at that single eye watching me, the heavier the air in the room felt. My child's brain couldn't make sense of it, but my instincts told me something was off. Still, I was just a kid, and kids don't always trust their gut. I told myself that it was fine, that it was just my mom being silly. Eventually, the weight of exhaustion pulled me back under, and I fell asleep. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, the memory of the night before came rushing back. I couldn't shake the image of her eye peeking through the crack in the closet door. I looked up at her as she sipped her coffee, and in my innocent way, I asked, "Mom, why were you hiding in my closet last night?" Her reaction wasn't what I expected. She froze, the mug halfway to her lips, and stared at me like I just said something impossible. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a careful tone, she asked, "What are you talking about? I didn't go into your room last night." I laughed, thinking she was joking. "Yes, you did. You stood by my bed, waved at me, and then went into my closet." Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. She put her coffee down and leaned in closer. "Honey," she said, "I didn't go into your room. I didn't even get out of bed last night." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I stared at her, waiting for her to crack a smile and say she was messing with me. But she didn't. She looked genuinely puzzled, and maybe a little scared. At first, she thought someone might have broken into the house. She checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked, but nothing was out of place. No signs of forced entry, no missing items. Eventually, she decided it must have been a bad dream or some kind of hallucination. She even tried to reassure me, saying, "Sometimes our brains play tricks on us when we're tired." But the thing is, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt real, vividly, unmistakably real. Over the years, I've only had 2 other hallucination-like experiences, and neither of them came close to being as detailed or as terrifying as this one. I can still see it in my mind as clearly as if it had just happened. Her eye peeking through the crack in the closet door, watching me. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but deep down, I know it wasn't. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't my mom. And to this day, I can't explain what it was. What do you think I experienced that night? Was it just a vivid dream? Or could it have been something paranormal? And if it wasn't a dream, who or what was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me from the closet? Let's hear your theories. Back in 2009, I spent a weekend with my uncle on his ranch. My parents were busy renovating the new house we had just bought, so they left me there for a few days. My uncle wasn't the warm, family-oriented type. He was more of a quiet, gruff man who mostly kept to himself. I didn't know him well and always felt a little uneasy around him, which only added to the strangeness of what happened that weekend. It was my second night there, a Saturday, and one of the biggest thunderstorms of the year rolled in. The storm was so intense that the crashes of thunder followed the lightning almost instantly. It felt like we were right in the heart of it. The flashes lit up the fields around the house, and the rolling thunder shook the walls. Oddly enough, I enjoyed listening to storms while lying in bed, so I stayed up later than usual, watching a movie on TV and soaking in the ambience. When the movie finally ended, I turned off the TV and tried to fall asleep, but the storm wasn't letting up. As I lay there, I heard something odd. Amid the thunder and rain, there was a distinct metallic thud, almost like something striking metal. At first, I thought it might have been part of the storm, maybe the wind blowing something into a fence or a tool left outside. But about 20 seconds later, I heard it again. This time, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just random noise. I told myself it was nothing and tried to ignore it, but the sound kept coming back. It seemed to coincide perfectly with the lightning strikes, each metallic thud sending a chill through me. By the third time, my curiosity got the better of me, and I forced myself out of bed. I walked over to the window of the guest bedroom, but the rain pouring down the glass made it nearly impossible to see anything clearly. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the property, but all I saw was the open field and the edge of the barn. The sound came again, louder this time. It seemed to be coming from the left of the window, just out of view. My heart started to race as I debated what to do. My uncle wasn't exactly approachable, and I didn't feel comfortable waking him up for something that might be nothing. Still, the noise was too consistent to ignore. I made up my mind to do something I knew he wouldn't like. I unlocked the window and slid it open, immediately feeling the cold wind and rain whip against my face. Sticking my head out, I looked to the left. At that exact moment, another flash of lightning illuminated the property, and I saw him. There, crouched by the outside basement door, was a man dressed entirely in black. He was hunched over, holding what looked like a metal tool or crowbar, and he was furiously bashing at the lock on the basement door. The sight was brief, just a split second before the light disappeared and the property was plunged back into darkness, but it was enough. My stomach dropped. I pulled my head back inside, slammed the window shut, and locked it as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the sound of the storm. Did he see me? Did he hear the window close? I didn't know. I crawled back into bed and lay there, facing the wall, pretending to be asleep. The lightning continued to crash, but this time, the metallic thuds stopped. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He was no longer trying to break in. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Was he still outside? Was he coming closer? I tried to stay perfectly still, hoping that if he didn't hear me or see me move, he might just go away. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to turn over and face the window. I'll never forget what I saw. Standing there, right at the window, was the man. His face was only inches from the glass, staring directly at me. The lightning illuminated him for just a moment, but that moment was enough to send me into a full-blown panic. I screamed as loudly as I could and bolted out of the room, running straight to my uncle's bedroom. I shook him awake, shouting incoherently about someone outside. To his credit, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hunting rifle and stormed out of the house, wearing nothing but his pajamas and no socks. The rain was still pouring as he circled the property, shouting into the darkness like a madman. I stayed inside, too terrified to even look out the window again. When he came back, drenched and shivering, he said he hadn't found anyone. But the next morning, in the light of day, we saw the evidence. The basement door's lock was mangled, covered in fresh dents where the man had been hitting it. My uncle examined it and said a few more strikes would have broken it completely. He gave me a rare smile and said, "Good thing you caught it when you did. You might have stopped something real bad." I left that day and never stayed at his ranch again. My uncle hasn't reported any incidents since, but then again, we don't talk much. I often think about what could have happened if I hadn't stayed up late that night, or if I hadn't decided to look out the window. Was the man just trying to rob the place? Or was he after something, or someone else? What do you think the man's intentions were? Was this a simple burglary attempt, or was there something more sinister at play? And if you had been in my position, would you have gone to the window, or woken someone up right away? Let's hear your thoughts. I don't care if anyone judges me, but I genuinely enjoy going to the movies alone. My work schedule is unpredictable, and I often find myself free on random weeknights. I've always been the type to avoid crowds. I prefer peace and quiet in everything I do. It was 2017, and on a stormy Wednesday night, I decided to treat myself to a low-key movie at the theater. It wasn't a blockbuster or anything big. It was one of those smaller films that most people wouldn't rush out to see. I had a feeling the theater would be empty, and I was right. When I arrived, there wasn't a single other person in the theater. I settled into the perfect spot, dead center in one of the higher rows, and kicked my feet up on the seat in front of me. This was my kind of night. The storm outside and the silence inside created the ideal atmosphere to enjoy a film uninterrupted. About 20 minutes into the movie, I noticed something odd. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement a few rows down. At first, I thought I might be imagining it, but when I glanced in that direction, I saw someone's head peeking over one of the seats. The room was dim because the scene in the movie was set in a dark room, so I couldn't make out much. I couldn't even tell if they were looking at me or just staring blankly into the void, but it was unsettling. When the movie scene shifted to a brighter moment, the light from the screen illuminated the theater just enough for me to see their face more clearly. And that's when the unease turned into full-blown discomfort. The person was looking directly at me, or at least it seemed that way. Their face was pale, almost unnaturally so, with lifeless, blank eyes. Their hair was long, wiry, and completely unkempt. I couldn't even tell if it was a man or a woman. As someone who's naturally introverted, confrontation is not my thing. My first instinct wasn't to yell or ask what they were doing. It was just to ignore it and hope they'd go away. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't focus on the movie. Then the screen went dark again, and in that instant, the person ducked down behind the seat, vanishing completely from view. My heart raced. What the hell was going on? For the next several minutes, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just some weirdo messing around. I did my best to get back into the movie and forget about it. But just as I started to relax, it happened again. The head reappeared, this time only 3 rows in front of me. I jumped so hard I actually shouted, "Holy shit!" loud enough to echo through the empty theater. Now, with the closer proximity and slightly better lighting from the screen, I could see the person more clearly. It was a man, and his face looked disturbingly lifeless. His eyes were wide open but completely motionless, staring into nothingness, or maybe at me. His expression didn't change. His long, greasy hair clung to his pale face like he hadn't showered in weeks. That was it. I was done. I bolted out of my seat and headed for the exit. The problem was, the only way to leave was to pass the row where the man was. My heart was pounding as I walked quickly but carefully past, trying not to look. But curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced down the row as I passed. What I saw stopped me cold. The man wasn't sitting in the seat. Instead, he was lying on the floor, holding something up in his hands. It was a stick, and perched on top of it was a severed human head. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. The head looked so real, so lifelike. My legs finally kicked into gear, and I ran for the exit as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I was out of the theater and in the parking lot. Jumping into my car, I locked the doors and drove home in a blind panic, my hands shaking the entire way. When I got home, I couldn't shake the image of that head. It haunted me. I sat at my computer and started searching online for any news of recent murders or missing persons in the area. After a while, I came across a listing for a 17-year-old boy named Donald Watkins who had been missing for about a month. My stomach dropped. The picture of Donald bore an eerie resemblance to the face I saw in that theater. The hair, the eyes, the nose, it all matched. Or maybe it was just my mind trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next day, I called the theater and told them everything. I urged them to check their security cameras to see if anything strange came up. I left my number in case they needed to reach me, but they never called back. I decided not to spend any more energy on it, though the memory has never left me. To this day, I still wonder what I witnessed. Was it some elaborate, sick prank? Was the head real, and if so, who was that man? Could it have been Donald Watkins? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? And why would someone do something so horrifying in an empty theater? What do you think? Was this some twisted joke? Or could there have been something far more sinister at play? And if it were you, would you have stayed to investigate further? Or run like I did? Let's hear your thoughts. When I was younger, I lived with my best friend Ben for a short time on a quiet street in Northville, Michigan. It wasn't the best area, close enough to Detroit to get some of the city's rough edges, but the rent was unbeatable, which was perfect for two broke guys in our early 20s. Ben and I had been friends since we were kids, so moving in together felt like a natural choice. We even worked at the same job, so it seemed like it would be a smooth arrangement. From the moment we moved in, though, something about the neighborhood felt off. Across the street from our house was a rundown, abandoned property that immediately caught our attention. The yard was overgrown with tall grass and tangled bushes, and graffiti covered the fence and one of the front windows. It looked like no one had lived there for years. To make things worse, many of the other houses on the block looked equally neglected, some completely boarded up. Our neighbors didn't make things any better. On one side, we had a sketchy family we avoided entirely. On the other side, there was an older man named Marv. He had long gray hair, a matching beard, and an old hippie vibe about him. He wasn't exactly unfriendly, but there was something odd about him. His conversations were hard to follow, and his messy house didn't help his image. We met him briefly on our second day there, and he casually mentioned that the house across the street had been abandoned for as long as he could remember. That evening, as the sun was setting, Ben and I sat on the front stoop, sharing cigarettes and talking about the usual nonsense. I remember glancing over at the house across the street, and that's when I froze. My stomach dropped. I stood up so fast I nearly dropped my cigarette. "Ben," I said, my voice shaking, "look at the window. Do you see that?" Ben squinted, confused, as I pointed to the lone upstairs window of the house. For just a split second, I had seen a face. Someone, or something, was staring at us. But before Ben could catch it, the figure moved, ducking out of sight behind the glass. "There was someone there," I insisted. "They were looking at us." Ben glanced at the window again but saw nothing. Still, he believed me, mostly because he could tell how shaken I was. "That's creepy as hell," he muttered. We decided to go talk to Marv, figuring he might know more about the house. But when we knocked on his door, there was no answer, even though we could clearly see him sitting in his living room watching TV. For some reason, he didn't even acknowledge us, which only added to the uneasiness. By this point, the situation felt so surreal that it almost became funny. Almost. But our nerves were on edge, and Ben's humor quickly turned into something more reckless. "Let's go check it out," he said with a grin, holding up the katana he'd brought with him when we moved in. Ben wasn't kidding. He'd always been the adventurous type, and as kids, we'd gotten into plenty of trouble together. This was just another thrill for him. I wasn't as eager, but I wasn't about to let him go alone. Once it got dark, we crossed the street with flashlights in hand, slipped into the backyard, and broke the board holding the back door shut. As soon as we stepped inside, we were hit with the smell of mildew and dust. The house was in bad shape, but surprisingly, there was no graffiti or vandalism inside. It was eerily quiet, almost like it had been frozen in time. The first floor was small, just a kitchen, a living room, and a dining room. There was no basement and only one closet to check. So far, nothing out of the ordinary, though the oppressive silence made every creak of the floorboards feel deafening. Then it was time to check upstairs. As we stood at the base of the stairs, Ben suddenly shouted, "Is anyone up there? What the hell is wrong with you?" I hissed, my heart pounding, and then we heard it. Heavy, rapid footsteps, someone running across the upstairs floor, straight toward the stairs. I swear, for a moment, my heart stopped. I couldn't even move. Ben, clutching his katana, grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the back door. "Go!" he yelled. We didn't stop running until we were back at our house, gasping for breath. But the strangest part? When we looked toward Marv's house, he was standing at his window, watching us intently. He didn't wave or smile. He just stared. It was unsettling, to say the least. We locked the door behind us and sat in silence, trying to process what had just happened. Neither of us wanted to call the police. We didn't have much to go on, and frankly, we weren't eager to explain why we'd broken into a house. But we both agreed on one thing. We couldn't stay. The next morning, we packed up our things and left. We told the landlord that the location wasn't working for us and that we needed to move out immediately. Within a few hours, we were gone, and we never looked back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was in that house. Was it a squatter? Something more sinister? And why was Marv acting so strange? I'll probably never know, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps or the look on Marv's face as he watched us from his window. What do you think was really going on in that house? Was it just a squatter? Or could it have been something far creepier? And what about Marv? Was he hiding something or just a strange old man? Let's hear your theories. For my son's 12th birthday, my wife and I decided to throw him a backyard party. We invited the whole family, as we usually did for our kids' birthdays, and let him bring along all his friends. Living in rural New Jersey, our backyard stretches into a forest on two sides, giving us plenty of space for gatherings like this. The property is big enough to spread out tables, food, and games across the yard, creating the perfect environment for celebrations. The party went on late into the evening. By around 8 o'clock, most of the guests had already left, but some close relatives and family friends stayed behind. The kids were still full of energy, laughing and running around the yard while the adults settled into casual conversations. It was a nice scene, except for one thing. The mosquitoes, they were relentless, buzzing around and biting anyone in sight. Deciding to do something about it, I headed to the shed at the far end of the yard to grab a few tiki torches. The shed is right by the edge of the woods, tucked into a shadowy corner of the property. As I rummaged around inside, pulling out about 6 torches, I suddenly heard faint footsteps coming from the forest. I stopped what I was doing and peered out into the dark trees. The forest was quiet, except for the usual hum of crickets, but something about those footsteps made me uneasy. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other harmless animal. After finding the torch fuel, I walked back to the yard, where everyone else was still chatting and laughing. I pitched the torches into the ground, spaced them out around the yard, and lit them. The warm glow created a comforting bubble of light that kept the mosquitoes at bay and added to the cozy atmosphere. That's when the kids, including my son, decided they wanted to play hide and seek in the woods. My wife and I were hesitant at first, but they begged us until we caved. "Just stay near the tree line," I told them, "and don't go too far in." They promised, and off they went, disappearing into the shadows with flashlights and giggles. For the next 15 minutes, we could hear them laughing and calling out to each other in the near distance. It was nice to have a moment of peace, just talking with relatives while the kids enjoyed themselves. But then, the mood shifted. The playful shouts and laughter turned into panicked screams. We all froze, looking at each other with growing concern. One by one, the kids came bolting out of the woods, their faces pale and their voices frantic. "There's something in there!" they shouted, tears forming in some of their eyes. My first thought wasn't a bear or any big animal. Those are rare around here. Instead, I was filled with a creeping sense of dread. I told the kids to stay near the patio area with my wife and the other adults while my brother Dom and I decided to investigate. We're both pretty big guys, and if anyone was going to check it out, it had to be us. Grabbing a couple of flashlights, we headed into the pitch-black woods. The night was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. At first, we didn't hear anything unusual, but as we ventured deeper, a new sound emerged. It was faint at first, almost like an animal's low growl, but it had a strange, unnatural tone. The deeper we went, the more it sounded human. Dom and I exchanged uneasy glances. Neither of us spoke, but I could tell we were both thinking the same thing. Something or someone was out there, watching us. I stopped Dom with an outstretched arm, signaling him to stand still. The sound grew louder, morphing into a moaning, guttural noise that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound fully human, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard, either. Then, we heard it, a sudden crack of leaves ahead of us. Our flashlights whipped toward the sound. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure darting behind a tree. The moaning stopped. Dom, in an attempt to be brave, stepped forward and shouted, "Hey, who's out there?" His voice echoed through the woods, but what happened next made my blood run cold. A scream erupted from the darkness, so loud and piercing that it rattled me to my core. It was nothing like a normal human scream. It was guttural, blood-curdling, and otherworldly, like something straight out of a nightmare. My instinct kicked in before my brain could even process what I was hearing. Dom and I turned and ran as fast as we could, crashing through the underbrush until we reached the yard. We waved frantically at everyone to get inside the house. Dom grabbed his phone and called the sheriff's department while the rest of us locked the doors and huddled together, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When the sheriff arrived, we explained everything. He dismissed it as a wild animal, maybe a coyote or fox, but Dom and I weren't convinced. That sound, it wasn't something you'd expect from any animal in these parts. It was too deliberate, too chilling. To this day, we still don't know what we encountered in those woods. Was it just some bizarre animal we'd never heard before? Or was it something else entirely? Something that was stalking us and the kids that night? And that scream, I can still hear it in my nightmares. What do you think it was? Was it just an overactive imagination fueled by the darkness and tension? Or could there be something truly unexplainable lurking in those woods? Would you have gone into the forest or stayed back with the others? Let's discuss.